So today we're out and about taking some portraits with some cool graffiti in the background, but the main thing is we're going to be comparing an 85mm against a 105mm and a 135mm to find out what the differences are between these lenses, pros and cons, and ultimately which is the best focal length for taking portraits. During this shoot, I'm going to be using my Sony A7III with the Sigma 85mm f1.4 DG-DN, the Sigma 105mm f1.4 DG HSM, and also the Sigma 135mm f1.8 DG HSM. So the first thing we're going to compare is the field of view of these focal lengths to see just how much you can fit within the frame. To test this, I sat in the same exact spot and our model Georgie also stayed in the same place. The only thing that changed was the lens on the front of my camera. Now, it shouldn't be that much of a surprise to you that the 85mm is the shortest lens in our lineup, so it has the widest field of view of the three lenses. Though that said, it's still quite a long lens relatively speaking, so you'll need to get some distance between yourself and the subject if you're intending on capturing full-length portraits. The 105mm lens offers a slightly tighter field of view than the 85, but it's not a massive jump. And then finally, the 135mm is the longest lens, so it has the tightest field of view, making it the best option if you're looking to shoot your subject from a distance. For example, as a wedding photographer, this kind of lens is ideal for capturing candid shots, as it means that I can take portraits from a distance, and half of the time people don't even realize I'm taking their portrait. The downside to this, of course, is that you'll need to be a significant distance from your subject if you're ever going to stand a chance of capturing a full-length portrait. To demonstrate this point a little bit better, I asked my model Georgie to stay in the same position whilst I changed my location with every lens change in order to keep her the same size within each of the photos. And as you can see, although I need to be a fair distance from Georgie with the 85mm to fit her within the frame, with the 135mm I need to stand way back in order to fit her in. Obviously for this shoot where we were out in the street, this wasn't much of a problem as I had tons of space to work in, but you may not always have this much room to shoot in, so this is where the 85mm becomes the more practical of the three choices. Being that far away from Georgie with the 135mm also made it quite hard to communicate with her too, and I found myself having to shout in order for her to hear me, especially over the busy city background noise. When it comes to bokeh, because all of these lenses are fairly long in terms of focal length, and they're also capable of shooting with a super wide maximum aperture of either f1.4 or f1.8, you're going to achieve a super thick blur in the background of your portraits, which really helps to separate the subject from their surroundings. Also, because these lenses are fairly long, they won't produce much distortion either, which means that for close-up headshots in particular, you're going to get nice, flattering portraits. This becomes a lot more obvious when you compare these images to something that I've shot with a wider focal length, where facial features become much more distorted and less flattering when shooting close up. One final thing you'll need to consider when choosing between these focal lengths is size, weight, and price. Now, generally speaking, most 85mm lenses are relatively small and lightweight, making them a lot easier to shoot with for long periods of time. Most 85mm lenses will offer a fast maximum aperture of f1.4 or f1.8, with f1.8 lenses generally being quite affordable, priced between £300 and £500 or $400 and $600. The Sigma 85mm f1.4 that I own is a bit more expensive and costs around £950 or $1,100, but that's because you usually have to pay more for an f1.4 lens. In comparison, there is a lot less choice when it comes to picking 105mm and 135mm lenses, especially for Sony E-mount cameras. The 105mm f1.4 lens from Sigma that I've been using today is an absolute beast of a lens and weighs 1.6 kilograms or 3.62 pounds, and I have quite rightly nicknamed it the bazooka. In terms of price, it's not that much more expensive than my 85mm lens, coming in at £1,199 or $1,599, but it's far from cheap. Sigma also manufactures the other 105mm option available for Sony E-mount, which is actually a 105mm f2.8 macro lens, but I've used this lens to take portraits myself and it's actually quite a nice alternative. It's much smaller, lighter and cheaper than the f1.4 version, costing just £699 or $799, and it also has the ability to shoot macro shots, which is quite a handy bonus. Finally, the 135mm options from Sigma and Sony are both fairly large, heavy heavy and will cost you over £1,000 or $1,200. But of the three focal lengths, a 135mm lens will give you the most reach and subject separation of the bunch. So with all of this in mind, if you're still struggling to decide which focal length is the best for you, then here's my roundup. The 85mm focal length is generally the most affordable, lightweight and practical option, and is probably the one to go for if you prefer to work light, or if you're relatively new to portrait photography and you're just looking for a nice portrait lens to start off your lens collection. The 105mm is kind of a specialist lens and is really intended for photographers who are looking for something a little bit special. Because of its size and weight, it's really not that practical to use for long periods of time, unless of course you're stacked like Arnold himself, but this lens really shines when taking individual portraits and has a big cult following. And finally, the 135mm is ideal for anyone looking for a telephoto prime lens with a fair amount of reach, though taking full-length portraits will require you to stand a fair amount of distance away from your subject. If you're interested to know which of these three Sigma lenses I've been shooting with today is the absolute best in terms of handling, image quality and autofocus performance, then be sure to check out next week's video where I'll be testing these specific lenses head to head.